of people who think they're Muslims are in fact not Muslims at all. It's a really distasteful insult, I would say, to the divine moral coherence, to say that the entire cosmos has been created by one who describes himself as Rahman and Rahim, and in fact such a tiny fragment of humanity has got things right. Strange how people can believe that such a world could have been created. Of course, this psychic state exists universally. It's not just a Muslim problem. It exists not just in Islam, it exists in Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism. It existed last week in Skokie, when somebody from an ostensibly Christian movement, at least it calls itself Christian, opened fire on passers-by. There's a conspicuous tendency in the marginalized youth of really of all religious communities towards a kind of exclusivism. In Islamic manifestations, it's reasonable to suppose that this tendency is going to grow, as I said, in relative significance as we traverse the end of the century. One aspect of it that is post-traditional is that it's not millenarial in its rhetoric. Earlier, radical, politically destabilizing movements in the Islamic world tended to arise with the idea that the Mahdi was nigh, or even that their leader was the Mahdi. It's a sign of decadence, if you like, that we don't talk in those terms any longer. We've become perhaps rather secularized. This movement is going to stay with us. It will continue to drag the name of our religion through the mud by slitting the throats of tourists and detonating minor targets in pinprick attacks on Western interests, attacks that, of course, do the cause of Islam immeasurable harm. As well as dividing the Islamic movement, dividing our communities, introducing bitterness and suspicion into our communities, it's going to provide the regimes with an excuse further to suppress religion generally and to marginalize it, and hence to drive even more of this lost generation of young activists into the arms of forms of extremism. Now, this threat of neo-Khariji heresy is thus a real one. It's already with us. We cannot treat it as a movement of a few aberrants on the fringes. It is starting to move into communities more generally, and it's important that Muslim communities, ethnic groups, mosques and so forth do hold regular events to analyze these movements, who is supporting them, what their beliefs are, and to try and liaise and present, first of all, the real face of Islam to the ambient culture and media, and also to try and out-argue them by training indigenous, traditional Sunni ulama who can simply defeat them using the scriptural arguments. There is no other way, really, of defeating them. That's the only logic that they will understand. But I want now to move on to the third of my three themes, and one that perhaps is even more apocalyptic, as it were, than the other two. And this is the theme of the environment, something that we Muslims hardly ever seem to talk about. And this is really very peculiar because the Quran itself is an environmentally sensitive document. It's a religious text that endlessly conjures with the signs of the natural world as evidences for the goodness and beauty and providence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Generally, we don't seem to pay much attention to that aspect of the book. But certainly it should frame our response to the environmental crisis, which is not going away and is becoming more and more urgent, so much so that certainly the Western world is taking it with deadly seriousness. There's a whole cluster of questions here, obviously. Clearly, as we leave the present century, our planet is in disastrous shape. Compared to 100 years ago, and certainly in catastrophic shape compared to, say, the year 1000. And the fault lies with materialism, greed, enabled particularly by Enlightenment fantasies of noble human beings transcending the fetters of nature, presiding over the physical order, and also of a certain type of Protestant capitalist ethic, which has really presided over what we might describe as the gang rape of Mother Earth. The planet is in very bad shape. Everywhere the face of the planet is scarred. Megatons of toxic waste are now swimming about in our oceans. or hovering in the stratosphere. Every day, another 12 named species becomes extinct. Biologists once told me that probably there's about 100 species that become extinct every day that we don't know about. And I asked him, well, how do you know? He said that was a rather interesting question. But the scale of the catastrophe is certainly greater than that scientists are able to measure. Every form of life, apart from our own and certain domestic animals, is facing a kind of holocaust, decimated by the massacres of modernity. In England, we're still worrying about the BSE disaster. UK government analysts called in by politicians to quell public fears about the outbreak of the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is this terrible, debilitating illness that affects people who've been eating this beef produced from cows who have been fed on animal offal, thus violating the natural order. They reckon that maybe 30,000 British people have already been contaminated with this disease, but they don't really know. One of the most alarming features of the present breakdown in the traditional natural order of the cosmos is that we really, because this has never happened before, have no idea of its true extent or its true implications. The natural order is so finely balanced. As always, progress is a monumental gamble. But the most urgent crisis that we face as we move into the new and, in many ways, ominous millennium is the issue of global warming. Global warming, and again we don't know quite how much is up there, but certainly for 100 years we've been pumping greenhouse gases into the skies, and we're now beginning to realize that the bill for this activity has to be paid. Now, Muslims have to focus on this issue really more than almost anybody else, because it's going to affect Islamic countries far more radically than the West. But disturbingly, very few people in the Islamic world really seem to have grappled with the question. In England now, global warming is noted even by the ordinary citizen. Temperature records where I live go back 300 years, but the 10 hottest years have all occurred since 1945. And 4 of the 5 hottest have been in the past decade. Rainfall, no less erratic, so that 1997 experienced the driest January for 200 years. Ocean storms have become so violent that the North Sea oil industry is now forced to lay pipelines under the sea rather than use tankers, because the seas are simply too rough now. The exact figures, surprisingly enough, do seem to be tiny. It's estimated that the rise in average world temperature between 1990 and 2050 will be a mere 1.5 degrees centigrade. But the rise in temperature, which 4 millennia ago ended the last ice age, was only half a degree more than this. Research has shown that the polar ice caps are already starting to melt, which is why the sea level is now creeping up by 5 millimeters a year. Places like the North Norfolk coast, the European Union is spending billions of pounds on new concrete defences to keep the sea at bay. But clearly the natural disorder that has been unleashed through the breakdown of a traditional, natural, balanced approach to the environment